What is going on, knife nerds? Today we are taking a look at the EMP EDC Nymble. So this is a pretty sweet little knife here. This was lent in to the channel for review by my buddy Stevie that I know from the EDC community on Facebook. And he sent it in. He wanted me to check it out. And I had not heard of this knife until he actually mentioned it, and so I totally missed out on it. It was obviously a pretty small batch drop. This is the first folder designed by a Mr. John Rusk, who I guess is the proprietor of EMP EDC, which means every man's pocket. And so some pretty cool branding going on there with the company. He talks about this being his first folder design, that he went from sketchpad to reality, and the OEM that he went with to build this knife was QSP, which is a pretty newer company that's been making some waves in the knife world here recently. They do a lot of budget stuff that a lot of people really dig, and some, higher end stuff too. That's pretty cool. And yeah, the build quality of this knife's pretty sweet. Let me get some specs for you. The blade material is M390. The blade length is 3.1 inches. Blade stock is 3.5 millimeters thick. It is a flat grind with belt satin flats. Belt satin bevel and hand rubbed satin flats there. And it weighs 3.67 ounces for the frag pattern. This is the bronze frag pattern edition. They also had another version that was a blue stonewash, I do believe, with just plain flat sides with no frag pattern on it. And so let's get a good look at this here. It does have a gold anodized backspacer and pocket clip, and the hardware is all gold anodized as well. And they have a pretty cool little planetary style nuclear logo here on the pivot. We have the serial number here. This was released in early July. It's now July 28th, and they are very well sold out. I'm sure this is going to be a pretty big hit, so they're going to be bringing more pretty soon. And yeah, this is probably going to be a pretty sought after knife. We do have a lanyard cut out back here in the back. The back spacer is just smooth polished titanium. And on the blade here, we've got a pretty thick blade stock with jimping that runs about half of the blade. The jimping is very functional, and no matter where you put your thumb on the blade, you're going to hit it. You can choke up here and still have jimping underneath your thumb, and I mean, you can really choke up good. The ergos on this thing are phenomenal. It is a frame lock titanium flipper on bearings, and Stevie mentioned to me that he attempted to swap in skiff bearings into this knife, and apparently the bearings were sized a little bit weird, and so he didn't have success swapping in the skiff bearings. So he wanted me to open it up and take a look at that and get my thoughts on it. So I'm going to do that here in just a second. There is internal milling here, and so I'm not going to flashlight it. We'll just go ahead and see that when I open it. And the big deal with this, the reason that they call it the EDC Nymble, is because there is several ways to deploy this blade. As you can see here, it's got a front flipper, a top flipper, and a hole in the blade for Spidey Flick. So I've just played with this a little bit, and my personal favorite way to deploy this knife is definitely the Spidey Flick so far, although the other functions work perfectly fine too. The low profile flipper tab here is actually very, very nice. Good detent on it, and yeah, it flips real hard with authority. And the front flipper works perfectly good too. And yeah, it's just a really, really fidgety, fun to play with little knife. But you know, it's also a little tank. I mean, this thing is a little bruiser. In the reverse grip here, in the back grip here, I'm able to just barely get 4 fingers on it. That 4th finger is just right at the end of the knife there, but I am able to achieve 4 fingers on the blade. And then in that choked up grip, you know, if you're doing some harder work, this feels really good right here. This is, you know, this is a good way to hang on to this knife. Very good ergonomically in this position. And, you know, pretty smooth action, drop shutty, super snappy detent. This thing is freaking cool, man. They did run $289, which is not a bad price for what you're getting here, especially with this frag pattern. There's a lot of, you know, companies out there that when they do this frag pattern, the knife suddenly doubles in price. So this is pretty nice, and I really dig the color that they did here. They're calling this bronze. I'm not sure I'd really refer to it as a bronze. It's almost like a gunmetal gray, and yeah, pretty wicked to me, the color that they did here. And so yeah, dig it a lot. When the next batch of these drops, I might just pick one up. This is definitely something that is right up my alleyway here. It is pretty thin behind the edge, despite being a super thick blade stock here, with a very robust tip and a small swedge grind up top there. We've got a little bead blasted finish down here in the fuller cutout. And yeah, you can actually thumb flick it with that too, but it's not as much fun as the other deployment method, so I don't think most people will do that. You know, the flipper tab works phenomenally. Front flipper's good to go. Spidey Flick, super good to go. It's kind of a spear point design blade. Nice belt satin finish on it. And yeah, so that's about it for the action and the aesthetics. Let's go ahead and take her down real quick here and see what's going on inside. So we've got a T8 here on the pivot. I always leave the blade open when I disassemble a frame lock knife like this. I don't know why people like to disassemble them with the blade closed. I don't know, I guess it's just preference, but this is my preference. I like to keep the blade open so that, you know, things aren't wanting to fly apart when you get it broken down. So we got some T6 screws back here, which are clearly titanium since they are anodized gold. Looks like all the hardware is titanium. So 2 clips to remove the 2 screws to remove the pocket clip there, and one of those, the top screw there, is actually a body screw, and the bottom one is not a body screw. And so you do have 2 points of retention back there. And then get this one more body screw off of here, and we should have it apart. Pretty simple construction. We've got standoffs that are flow through on the back spacer. Super cool. We've definitely got some nice weight relief milling in here. Hardened steel race washers, and it is an internal stop pin. And we've got a lock bar insert there with the detent ball mounted in the lock bar insert. I definitely prefer that to having the detent ball mounted in the titanium personally. I feel like that's a stronger, the steel is stronger than the titanium. So I feel like that ball stays retained better in the lock bar insert. It's easier to replace. If there is a problem for the manufacturer, they can just replace that little lock bar insert. And I always like that. Yeah, I definitely see here that these are not standard size bearings. Wow, those are really, really tiny little balls in there. So hang on, let me reach over here and grab a normal size bearing. I had one just laying around. Okay, if I can do this without knocking over the camera. Okay, so what we have here is a standard size bearing. So these little balls that you see here in the bearing cage are typically one of two sizes. They're usually either 1/16 inch or 3/32 inch, being the larger size. These are the 1/16 that are pretty standard on most production knives that we purchase nowadays. These are the bearings out of the EMP EDC. And as you can see, there is a massive difference there. The 1/16 balls are way bigger than these. So that's pretty interesting. I've not ever seen this size of bearing used in a folding knife before. So this is groundbreaking first-hand stuff here for me. He did mention that he felt like the bearings were a little bit loose in the race, and I can definitely see what he means here. The OD of the race is much larger than the bearing cage there. However, they're very tightly fitted to the pivot, so these are going to ride perfectly stable on the bearing race there. So I don't see that as being an issue. He said he heard some rattling from the bearings, and I would say that the reason that he's hearing that rattling is because there's no lube in the bearings, and that's normal. It's something that it's the reason that I prefer to run lube in my bearings, because you will hear the balls actually rattling in the cages. When you're fidgeting with the knife, when you're running it dry in the pivot like that, you'll actually hear those little balls kind of rattling around in the cages. And so yeah, that's what that is, Stevie. And I don't know if you want me to lube these or not. That's entirely up to you. I'll ask you about it later, and if you want me to, I will. And that would definitely stop the rattling. I'm assuming that the reason that they went with these little bearings is because it's a pretty compact knife. Sorry, I'm getting off frame here. It's a pretty compact knife, and they just have a lot going on in here with the way that this lock bar cutout is designed and the way that the internal stop pins ride. It's a pretty tight pivot area, and so they went with these smaller bearings for whatever reason. Maybe they wanted thicker race washers in here for more stability. Let me see if I can get this race washer out. We're going to see how thick it is. That's a pretty average thickness there on the race washer. It's not overly thick. So I'm not really sure. I guess they, maybe it's just a QSP thing. They're a newer manufacturer, and maybe it's just a thing that they do that's different than most other Chinese manufacturers, Chinese OEMs. So yeah, I dig the work here. I think it's equivalent to Bestech. It's equivalent to Wii even. They just used a weird oddball size caged bearing. And so No big deal. You just can't swap in the skiffs because the balls are a completely different size. And so if you went with some thinner race washers, you might be able to do that. You'd have to figure out the exact sizes and you know, all that stuff, and then maybe you could do it, but probably not worth the effort. You know, the action is phenomenal as it is, so I don't see a big deal, you know, a big reason to go ahead and swap in the skiff bearings here. It does have a D-shaped captured pivot there, and so that's awesome. And so non-free spinning pivot, always got to love that. Very simple construction, very good quality. And oh, I think I'm actually gonna flip the bearings over, because one of them was kind of upside down. Not that they have a specific side, but I just prefer to have the cupped side of the bearing facing into the blade. And so yeah, simple. I dig it, man. This is a cool little knife. We're just gonna pop her back together here. I'm gonna give Stevie a shout here in a minute and see if he wants me to lube these bearings, Loctite it, or any of that good stuff. And he has sent in a couple of knives for sharpening along with this. And so I'm going to be reviewing his Ferrum Forge Mordax coming up next. And I put a new fresh edge on that. I had a wrong size screwdriver, duh. I had a Ferrum Forge Mordax briefly, and unfortunately mine came out of the factory with some quality control issues. It had a unfixable blade centering problem because of a bad blade grind, I believe. And the detent was really pretty weak on it. And so this is the second Mordax from ProTech that I have handled, and Stevie's is much more dialed in than mine was. You know, everything's nice and tight on his. The blade is good and centered, and so it's pretty cool. We're gonna check that out in another review, though. I'm getting off on a tangent here, and so we are currently on the EMP EDC. Okay, no blade play. Maybe got it a hair tight. Maybe it's just a tad too loose now. So we're just very little adjustment there. Micro adjustment, and that's perfect. Man, this is freaking cool. I'm jealous of Stevie's EMP EDC, and I must have one myself. Yeah, not a huge knife. But it's not, you know, it's not so small that it's not fun. It's a good sized little knife. And so other than that, that's just my first impressions on this knife. And you guys take it easy. We'll see you in the next one. Later.